Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. This book tells in detail about the Muslim conquest of Spain under the Umayyad Caliphate from 711 AD to 718 AD. The conquest is also known as the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula or the Umayyad conquest of the Visigothic kingdom. This conquest destroyed the Visigothic kingdom and established the Umayyad wilaya of Al-Andalus. It also resulted in the expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate and the Muslim rule into Europe. The last chapter. Start of chapter 20. Islam in Spain. We come to the end of this volume. There is a lot more to the military history of Muslim Spain. There were wars and campaigns and battles. There were holy wars and civil wars, epochs of grandeur and periods of disgrace, feats of heroism and acts of treachery, spread over 8 centuries of Spanish history until the last tragic act of the drama, when the curtain fell on Granada in 1491. But that was not part of the conquest. It will be related in other volumes. Yet, it would not be right to leave the reader with the bitter memory of an assassination in his mind. We will therefore briefly recount the events which followed the murder of Abdulaziz and which converted the old Visigothic kingdom of Spain into the new Muslim state of Andalus. For some weeks, there was confusion in Seville. The shock waves of the assassination of the governor rippled across Spain. The soldiers were horrified by what had been done to their beloved commander, and during prayers in the mosque, seeing this reaction, the conspirators made haste to depart for Damascus with the head of their victim. Such was the affection and esteem in which Musa bin Nusayr and Abdulaziz bin Musa were held in Spain, that the soldiers themselves chose as their new leader a man from their family. This was a nephew of Musa, his sister's son, one named Ayub bin Habib, who had distinguished himself in the war in Spain and earned the respect of the soldiers. Ayub bin Habib was a brave warrior and an upright Muslim, and the people of Spain, Muslims and others, were glad to have him as their new ruler. But nothing special happened in the peninsula during his time. The only notable events which occurred in the short duration of his rule were the move of the capital and the construction of a castle. He moved to the capital from Seville to Cordoba because the latter was more central and facilitated control over the provinces. And during an expedition to the north, he leveled the old ruined Roman town of Bilbilis, 50 miles southwest of Saragossa, and built in its place a strong castle which came to be known as the Castle of Ayub, Qalat Ayub. The town is still there with the Spanish name of Calatayud. Ayub's rule lasted only 6 months. Then another governor was appointed by the governor of Africa at Kairouan, who himself had earlier been appointed by Caliph Suleiman. The new governor, Al-Hur bin Abdurrahman as-Saqafi, traveled to Cordoba with an escort of 400 horse, divested Ayub of his office, and took over as governor of Spain. According to some accounts, it was he and not Ayub who moved the capital to Cordoba. Ayub bin Habib was the last governor of Spain from the family of Musa bin Nusayr. With his replacement by Al-Hur, a new era began in the history of the peninsula. What Al-Hur did, and he did a great deal, will be narrated in another volume. When studying the causes of great historical events like the Muslim conquest of Spain, we must take care not to be diverted by direct causes, like Julian's desire for revenge. There are often deeper causes, unseen and intangible, which operate beneath the surface and impel events towards certain ends. Direct causes are merely instruments which bring about those ends, like keys which open doors. Had there been no seduction of a pretty Berber girl by a Visigothic king, the Muslims would still have landed in Spain in pursuance of the Quranic injunction to fight the infidel and spread the faith. It was this impulse which led to the expansion of Islam under the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the early caliphs. Behind the military campaigns lay the dynamic religious thrust of Islam, whose elemental power was tempered with the justice and humanity of Quranic law and prophetic tradition. The new faith, young and vigorous, possessed a powerful impetus, and until that impetus was spent, the conquest of Muslim arms would continue. Islam had a destiny to fulfill, an ideal to achieve. The whole war had to go on, blazing a trail through unbelieving lands, flattening all ramparts, destroying all enemies who stood in the path of the faithful. No enemy was too strong to check the advance of the Muslims, no nation too brave and warlike to intimidate them. Romans, Persians, Turks, Copts, Berbers, Goths, all fell in battle against the victorious soldiers of Islam. The holy warriors were led on by God's promise of the best of both worlds for the faithful, glory and gain in this world if they conquered, paradise in the next if they died. If there had been no Florinda and no Julian, no Romans and no Goths in Spain, there would have been someone else and something else. The Muslims would still have got to Spain. If there had been no Musa and no Tariq, there would have been other slaves of Allah seeking merit with their Lord. There would still be Moors in Spain. As a matter of interest, to the west they were known as Moors and still are. Originally the word was Maori and was brought into use by the Romans, although it is believed to be a Phoenician word meaning westerner. The Romans called their northwestern province of North Africa Mauritania, and the people Maoris. The true Moors were the Berbers of North Africa and not the Arabs, but over the centuries, the term was to acquire wider application to cover all Muslims of North Africa and Spain, even Spanish Muslims of pure Gothic descent. In Spanish, the word used was Moro. As a concluding part of this book, it will be useful to establish what Islam did to Spain, what the new faith brought to a troubled peninsula which had suffered for centuries from brutal conquerors and savage rulers. This is best seen against the background of the conditions which prevailed in Spain under the Germanic nations, which ruled or misruled the country for 300 years, and it is best seen through the eyes of Western and Christian historians who cannot be accused of prejudice against their own kind. At the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century, just before the eruption of the Germanic tribes, conditions in Spain were pitiable. It had been part of the Roman Empire for 600 years. In accordance with their imperial policy, the Romans had used Spain as they had used other provinces of the empire, as a source of wealth to enrich Rome and create the luxurious life for which Rome was famous. On the one hand in Spain, there were the possessors of huge estates called latifundia. On the other, there were the vast multitudes of impoverished citizens, serfs and slaves. The wealthy and powerful paid no taxes and enjoyed a special position with special privileges which none might challenge. The rich lived lives of unbridled luxury in splendid mansions. There, in halls rich with the painted and embroidered hangings of Persia and Assyria, slaves daily loaded the board with the choicest viands and the most generous wines, while the guests reclining upon couches spread with purple improvised verses, or were entertained by choirs of musicians or troops of dancing girls. Below the nobility and the rich upper class, There was a small middle class which groaned under the crushing weight of taxes and imposts. They were the only ones who paid taxes. Below this middle class of citizens, the rest of the population consisted of serfs and slaves. The serfs were agricultural laborers, slaves in a manner not of a person but of the land which they worked. They were better off than the slaves because they could legally marry, and could even become owners of their land, although they could not alienate it. They were tied to the soil they tilled. They could not leave it. The landlord could not dispose of his fields without the serfs, nor of his serfs without the fields. The most wretched and most pitiable of all men were the slaves. They were immensely numerous, it not being unusual for a man to possess thousands of slaves. They had no rights whatever and were entirely at the mercy of their masters, who could do with them as they pleased. They were bought and sold like cattle or household goods. They were treated with pitiless severity. A master could condemn a slave to 300 lashes for having kept him waiting for hot water, and what these poor wretches had to endure at the hands of their masters was nothing compared to the cruelties inflicted on them by overseers, who were slaves like themselves. Then came the Germanic nations, like a terrible tidal wave of savagery, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. The havoc they wrought had already been described in chapter 3, yet, in spite of knowing of the horror that was coming, the Romans and Romanized Spaniards did nothing to defend themselves against it. They had fallen too low to offer opposition to the barbarian invaders. Even as the barbarians were entering the gates of the cities, the rich, sunk in gluttony and drunkenness, danced and sang. Their trembling lips imprinted kisses on the bare shoulders of beautiful slave girls. Not a single town had the courage to sustain a siege. Everywhere the gates flew open, as though automatically to the barbarians who entered the cities without striking a blow. They plundered, they burned, but they had no need to kill. If they did so, it was but to satiate a lust for blood. The Visigothic kingdom had been established in Toulouse soon after the middle of the 5th century, and included the northeastern part of Spain. 100 years later it transferred its capital to Toledo, and soon after the Visigoths were in control of most of the peninsula. Henceforth, the law of Spain would be Visigothic law superimposed on Roman law. The lot of the serfs and slaves got worse rather than better under the Visigoths. Some of the brutality was institutionalized by passing harsh laws against fugitive serfs and slaves. Now neither serf nor slave could marry without the permission of the lord, and if he did, the wife was forcibly separated from the husband. When one married a woman belonging to another lord, the offspring of the marriage was shared between the two masters. In this respect, the law of the Visigoths was worse than the law of the Romans, which at least did not permit the separation of man and wife or children from parents. A new element which now entered relations between master and slave was the church. With the conversion of the Visigoths to the Catholic faith, the Roman Catholic clergy assumed greater power in the kingdom, commanding a position which the state would not dispute. The Christian clergy had promised to ameliorate the condition of the slaves once they gained possession of authority. But when that happened, fine principles were set aside. Possessed of vast domains densely populated with serfs, or splendid palaces crowded with slaves, the bishops recognized that the time for emancipating the serfs was not yet, and might not arrive for centuries to come. The Spanish church owned a large number of slaves, and the importance of a church was indicated by the number of slaves who belonged to it. If a parish church had fewer than 10 slaves, it was regarded as a very poor one, and was not entitled to have a priest of its own. Many bishops were no less cruel than other masters in the treatment they meted out to the slaves of the church. The helplessness and misery of the slaves did nothing to earn the compassion of their holy masters. The brutality of the clergy exceeded all bounds. When priests fell ill, they would sometimes blame their illness upon the slaves of their church, alleging that it had been caused by magic. They would then proceed to torture the slaves. This ill treatment went so far that in 660, the Lusitanian Synod declared that the bishop must put a limit to his anger. For no fault whatever must a bishop tear off a limb from any slave of the church. The 11th Church Council repeated what had more than once been enacted before, that priests and bishops must not shed blood. They must not put anyone to death or cut off his limbs or direct another to do so. Apparently, such horrors on the part of priests were not confined to church slaves. The council forbade them to treat freedmen also in this manner. So much for the serfs and slaves who comprised the bulk of the population. But it would be interesting to know something about the legal system and how it was applied by the Visigoths in Spain, because in this field the humane application of Islamic laws offers a sharp contrast. Torture was not only permitted but was an essential part of legal procedure. The practice was to torture free persons of any social class for not more than 3 days in the presence of a judge. If the accused died under torture, and it was proved that this was due to malice or corruption on the part of the judge himself was handed over to the relatives of the dead man to suffer the same treatment. The treatment of slaves was even worse. Nobles and high officials were more or less above the law and could get away with anything, not just murder. In the middle of the 7th century, King Ch20 ordered amendments to the law to bring these privileged individuals within its grasp in cases of treason, homicide, and adultery. The accuser had to deliver secretly to the king, or to judges appointed by the king, a written statement of charges with the signatures of 3 witnesses. During the inquiry by the court, the defendant was tortured. If he did not confess his crime, the accuser was handed over to him, though he was forbidden to put the accuser to death. King Ch20 also allowed royal slaves to give evidence in the courts without being tortured. All other slaves, when they had to testify, could do so only under torture. The king further declared that if a slave died or was maimed by torture, the man who made the charge against the slave would have to provide the slave's owner with 2 slaves of equal value. These are only glimpses, because we do not know a great deal about this period of the Dark Ages in Europe. They are, however, enough to give the reader an idea of the social conditions prevailing in Spain at the beginning of the 8th century. Yet the reader should not imagine that this was necessarily the Christian way of treating human beings. It was the way of the barbarians, because it was the age of barbarism in Spain. It had nothing to do with the gentle Christianity of Prophet Jesus, on whom be peace, who would have been horrified to know how the meek and the poor in spirit were being treated by those who professed to follow in his footsteps. That is how it was. It is against this background of barbarian life in Spain that we must see the impact of Islam on. The Muslim conquest of Spain was notable for the absence of suffering and horror which usually attend military invasions. There was no bloodshed, no rapine or destruction. The country was not devastated. The inhabitants were not slaughtered. The churches were not desecrated. The economy was not ravaged. The institutions were not dishonored. The women were not ravished. On the contrary, peace and stability were restored, order and discipline re-established, economic prosperity strengthened, the social conditions of life purified. With the coming of the Muslims, the land smiled. Spain turned over a new leaf in its history, for the first time a bright and cheerful one. Under the Muslims, there was complete religious tolerance. There was no religious persecution, not even pressure. The Christians and Jews were free to worship in their churches and synagogues as they pleased. Even Gibbon, no friend of Islam, is led to admit. Yet, if we compare the invasion of Spain by the Goths or its recovery by the kings of Castile and Aragon, we must applaud the moderation and discipline of the Arabian conquerors. This tribute, grudgingly conceded, is a gross understatement. The Muslims did not have to compare themselves with the Goths and the Spanish reconquistadors of later centuries to establish their claim to social and moral excellence. The tolerance of the Muslims was exemplary and unmatched by the followers of other prophets and other gods. Had the Muslims not been tolerant, there would have been no Christians left in the Iberian Peninsula, at least not more than there are Muslims today in Spain. As a result of this tolerance, the followers of all faiths were satisfied with their lot. The Jews were again free to practice their religious rites without interference and oppression. Even many Christians were happier than before, because the harshness of the clergy was curbed. Moreover, under the impact of the Muslim example and the justice and fair play introduced by them, a large number of Spaniards opted for the faith of their conquerors. This conversion was to advance by leaps and bounds. Those who were suffering in Spain gained from the coming of the Muslims. Those who were not suffering did not lose. The vanquished were left in peace to live under their own laws and be judged by their own judges. The Muslims gave them governors and counts of their own to see to their administration, to collect taxes and settle disputes. Territories conquered by the sword and the property belonging to the church and the nobles who had fled were taken over. 1/5 of such property belonged to the Muslim state and was earmarked as such, while the rest was parceled out among the conquering warriors. The serfs were left to till the land, from which the Muslim owners took a share of the crop as their due. The jizya was imposed on all non-Muslims. This tax was levied in return for exemption from military service and as a guarantee of protection against other enemies. The rate of jizya was 48 dirhams, silver pieces for the rich, 24 for citizens belonging to the middle class, and 12 for those who earned their living by manual labor. There was no jizya on women and children, on monks, on slaves, or on the handicapped. Any non-Muslim who became a Muslim automatically ceased to pay the jizya. All slaves belonging to the church and other institutions were freed. Those not freed, those belonging to individual owners, were given a new dignity and a right to decent humane treatment. Islam permitted the institution of slavery, but did not permit cruelty and brutality. A slave in Islam lived much like one of the family. When a slave girl bore a child, it was acknowledged as the legal offspring of the master with rights of inheritance. Many sultans and nobles in the centuries that followed were born to slave girls. Islam gave equality to all, high and low, creating a great brotherhood of mankind. There were economic differences. There were rich and poor, but there was no social difference. All Muslims sat together, ate together, prayed together. Before the law, all were equal. There was no torture, no intimidation, no corruption. For the first time in their history, the Spaniards experienced complete legal equality and justice. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on whom the peace, had said, "I have been promised the east of the earth and the west, and whatever has been promised to me will be mastered by my followers." So the Muslims mastered Spain. They settled down in the beautiful country and made it their own, becoming one with the land and its people. They would be there for 8 centuries, ruling part of the time over all of it, all of the time over part of it. They lived and ruled not as Arabs or Berbers or Spaniards, but as Muslims. Spanish Muslims to the world, Muslim Spaniards to themselves. This was the beginning of Muslim Spain, one of the most brilliant and most glorious epochs of human. End of chapter 20. End of the book The Muslim Conquest of Spain by A. I. Akram.